What if I told you that modern education might be quietly dismantling what it means to be truly human? In a world obsessed with facts, science, and utility. One of the 20th century's greatest minds, Lewis sounded an alarm few were ready to hear. In The Abolition of Man, he warned us about a future where human values are not merely debated, but abolished. And that future might already be here. Why did Lewis fear a world without objective values? What did he mean by men without chests? And how is his critique of education more relevant now than ever? Lewis wasn't just writing to scholars or theologians. He was speaking to everyone who believes in truth, beauty, and moral integrity. He saw a cultural shift where emotions were suppressed, where facts replaced values, and where the soul of humanity was being quietly drained by a cold, clinical mindset. He feared that if we stopped teaching children how to feel rightly, we'd soon raise generations who could no longer distinguish between courage and cowardice, loyalty and betrayal, or love and manipulation. In The Abolition of Man, Lewis explains how the loss of objective standards leads to the loss of meaning itself. If good and evil are just personal opinions, then power becomes the only rule that matters. When educators reduce values to mere preferences, they may think they're liberating young minds, but they're actually removing the foundation for any real sense of purpose or justice. Lewis's insight is striking. By eroding objective values in the classroom, society doesn't create freedom, manufactures moral confusion. The consequences aren't theoretical. They shape how we form relationships, how we view truth, and how we live as citizens. These ideas aren't abstract. They're being lived out in classrooms, courtrooms, and cultural debates right now. Even media and technology reflect this. Erosion, reinforcing the urgency of Lewis's message in nearly every facet of modern life today. This audiobook-style narration brings Lewis's timeless work to life, distilled and narrated in plain, powerful language while staying true to his message. It's not just a philosophical treatise, it's a defense of what makes us human. Whether you're a student, a teacher, a parent, or simply a seeker of wisdom, this journey will challenge the very way you see morality, emotion, and the role of education in shaping society. The Abolition of Man is more than a title, it's a warning. And this is where it begins. C.S. Lewis begins The Abolition of Man not with abstract arguments, but with a very specific critique. He targets a school textbook. This book, which he refers to as the Green Book, not its real title, claims to teach English composition, but subtly teaches moral relativism. Lewis is not upset over grammatical techniques. He's concerned with how values are portrayed and ultimately dismantled under the guise of reason. The authors of the textbook critique an example where a man sees a waterfall and describes it as sublime. They suggest that such a reaction is merely a statement about the observer's feelings, not an actual judgment about the object. Lewis sees this as dangerous. If we reduce all value statements to personal, emotional responses, we end up stripping away the ability to make any meaningful moral claim. Calling a waterfall sublime is not the same as saying, I feel something sublime. One is arespons ... Lewis argues that when educators strip away the idea of objective value, they do more than change how students speak, they change how students feel and think. Over time, this produces what he calls men without chests, human beings whose reasoning and appetites are intact, but whose chest, the seat of rightly ordered emotions, has been cut off. These are people who can argue and calculate, but lack the moral sentiments needed to feel loyalty, courage, or righteous indignation. The chest in Lewis's metaphor is the bridge between our intellect and our animal instincts. Without it, human beings become either coldly rational or base and impulsive, both lacking the emotional core that governs virtue. In other words, we lose our humanity not because we lack intelligence or instinct, but because we no longer feel as we ought. Lewis emphasizes that this is not about sentimentality. He's not advocating for irrational emotionalism. Instead, he's defending the tradition of ordinate affections, a concept that dates back to Plato and Augustine. It means feeling the right thing, toward the right object, in the right way. Courage, compassion, reverence. These are not arbitrary feelings, but appropriate responses to reality. A child who learns to admire noble acts is being shaped not into a sentimentalist, but into a moral being. When education teaches students to deconstruct these feelings, to see them merely as personal reactions or social constructions, it doesn't just remove bad ideas. It removes the moral muscle memory that enables virtue. What's left is a generation of clever people who are morally paralyzed. Lewis anticipates the counter-argument that society must free people from outdated moral codes so they can create their own. But to this, he replies with a warning. You can't train someone to make their own values by first teaching them that no values are true. That's not freedom. That's abandonment. It's like sending someone into battle without armor and calling them liberated. In his view, a real education doesn't merely transfer knowledge, it forms the soul. It doesn't just fill the mind. It trains the heart to love what is good and hate what is evil. Ancient and medieval thinkers believed that the purpose of learning was to conform the soul to objective reality. But modern education, as Lewis sees it, tries to make reality conform to the whims of the individual. He doesn't romanticize the past, but he believes we've forgotten something essential. Previous generations believed that some truths were universal and timeless. Modern educators, by contrast, tend to treat all values as subjective, cultural, or political. Lewis sees this as a catastrophic loss. If we dismantle objective values, in the name of progress, we may end up destroying the very tools that make moral progress possible. A society of men without chests can neither preserve tradition nor innovate ethically. They become skilled manipulators, not principled reformers. Lewis uses strong language because he believes the stakes are high. Once you teach children that values are subjective, you can no longer appeal to any higher principle when injustice occurs. Racism, exploitation, cruelty. And what basis do you condemn these if morality is just a preference? This first chapter is a wake-up call. It asks us to rethink what education is for and what kind of people we are producing. Are we forming character or just downloading information? Are we creating whole humans or just smart machines? Lewis's metaphor of men without chests is not meant to insult, it's meant to warn. He's pointing out a growing void in modern humanity. A generation that can reason clearly and desire intensely but cannot feel rightly. And in his view, that imbalance is the beginning of our undoing. Lewis is clear that the role of education is not neutral. Every curriculum, every lecture, every omission carries with it a moral posture, if that posture is one of denial. When schools suggest that moral language is subjective, they're not removing values, they're replacing them, and often the new values they promote, tolerance, autonomy, self-expression, are treated as absolute, even while denying the absolutes of the past. This contradiction, Lewis argues, creates confusion and cynicism in the young. He also connects this educational shift to broader cultural movements. When literature is taught without reverence, when art is analyzed solely for technique, and when history is reduced to power struggles, students are left without a sense of awe, wonder, or moral clarity. They may become technically skilled, but they lack the internal compass to use those skills for anything other than self-interest. Lewis isn't criticizing knowledge, he's criticizing the disconnection of knowledge from virtue. Another key insight in this chapter is Lewis's defense of what he calls the Tao, a term he borrows from Eastern philosophy to refer to the universal moral law. The Tao is not a religious doctrine in this context, but a recognition that all cultures, at their best, acknowledge some version of the same ethical truths: justice, courage, honesty, mercy. Lewis argues that true education works within the framework of the Tao. It doesn't invent morality from scratch, but it cultivates allegiance to these universal truths. Rejecting the Tao, according to Lewis, leads to moral bankruptcy. When students are taught to believe that all value judgments are culturally relative or emotionally constructed, they are cut off from any moral inheritance. They become, in effect, orphans disconnected from the wisdom of the past, with no map for navigating the future. Lewis's men without chests are not evil. They are the product of a system that refused to shape their moral instincts. This is why he criticizes educators, not for malice, but for negligence. He sees them as well-meaning, but misguided people who believe they are freeing the young from superstition when in fact they are leaving them defenseless. It is not enough to tear down outdated ideas. One must offer something true and sturdy in their place. At the heart of this chapter is a vision of what it means to be fully human. It is not enough to know what is right. We must also feel its weight. We must train the heart, not just the head. And that, Lewis insists, is what modern education is failing to do. To make matters worse, Lewis notes, the cultural environment reinforces this educational trend. Popular media, advertising, and entertainment all contribute to a worldview in which feelings are either mocked or commodified, and values are treated as outdated obstacles to personal freedom. In such a world, teaching a child to revere something greater than themselves is seen as indoctrination, while teaching them to believe in nothing is celebrated as intellectual independence. But Lewis argues that humans are not machines. We are not mere bundles of desires to be manipulated by algorithms or trained through incentives. We are moral beings who long for meaning, belonging, and purpose. When education fails to nurture this moral core, it creates not liberated minds, but confused hearts. He ends the chapter with a powerful implication. The decline of value-based education isn't just a philosophical problem, it's a civilizational one. When a culture produces individuals incapable of moral reasoning or emotional integrity, it risks losing its very soul. And once that soul is gone, no amount of innovation or efficiency can bring it back. These warnings were not exaggerated, they were prophetic and urgent. In the second chapter of The Abolition of Man, titled The Way, C.S. Lewis turns from critique to construction. If men without chests warned of what happens when we discard objective value, The Way explores what it means to uphold it and why abandoning it is not only foolish, but ultimately self-defeating. Lewis introduces the concept of the Tao, his term for the natural law or universal moral code. This isn't a specific religious doctrine, but a shared human recognition of right and wrong principles found in all great civilizations: kindness to the weak, respect for elders, honesty, justice, courage. The Tao is the accumulated moral wisdom of humankind, and for Lewis, it's not a burden of the past, but the foundation of the future. He explains that all real moral judgments depend on the Tao. Without it, we can't say one act is truly better than another, only that it's different or personally preferable. Yet the moment someone condemns injustice or praises heroism, they are appealing to something beyond mere opinion. They are invoking the Tao, whether they acknowledge it or not. Lewis challenges the modern idea that we can go beyond traditional morality, that we can reinvent ethics to suit new desires or scientific insights. He insists that we cannot reject the Tao without also rejecting the very basis for reasoning about morality, like trying to build a house while denying the laws of physics. Any attempt to construct a new ethical system outside the Tao ends in contradiction or collapse. One of Lewis's most striking arguments is that every attempt to create new values still smuggles in elements of the Tao. For instance, if someone says we should be kind for evolutionary reasons or for the good of society, they are still appealing to something: utility, compassion, survival that draws its worth from within the Tao. They haven't escaped it. They've simply renamed it. This leads Lewis to a powerful conclusion. There is no such thing as a value-free society. Every culture, no matter how modern or secular, relies on some version of the Tao to make sense of right and wrong. Even critiques of morality assume moral ground. When someone says a belief is oppressive or outdated, they are presuming a moral standard by which to judge it. So what happens when a culture consciously rejects the Tao? Lewis warns that it becomes incapable of moral reasoning. Without shared standards, all ethical debates reduce to power struggles or emotional preferences. A society that no longer believes in objective value cannot cultivate virtue, cannot resolve conflict, and cannot inspire greatness. Lewis anticipates an objection. Isn't morality always evolving? Haven't societies changed their views on slavery, equality, and justice? He agrees that moral knowledge can develop, but only within the Tao. Just as science progresses without discarding the laws of logic, so too moral understanding deepens within the structure of objective value. Abandon the Tao, and you lose the very framework that makes progress possible. He emphasizes that moral innovation is not the same as moral rebellion. Great reformers like Socrates, Jesus, or Gandhi didn't discard moral law. They appealed to a deeper version of it. They called their societies to live more fully in line with eternal truths, not to replace those truths with personal preference. Throughout the chapter, Lewis dismantles the modern temptation to view tradition as inherently oppressive and reason. As its liberator, he argues that without tradition, without the Tao, reason itself becomes impotent. Logic cannot tell you what to value. It can only tell you how to achieve what you already value. And if those values are untethered from objective reality, reason becomes the servant of desire, not its master. At the heart of this chapter is a call to humility. Lewis invites readers to recognize that they are heirs to a moral heritage far richer than any individual intellect. To discard the Tao in pursuit of autonomy is like burning your map because you want to chart your own course. Noble in theory, disastrous in practice. He acknowledges that many people reject the Tao not out of malice, but because they see it as limiting. But he responds that true freedom comes not from abandoning constraints, but from aligning oneself with truth. Just as a musician finds creative freedom by mastering the rules of harmony, so a human being flourishes by living in accordance with moral order. Lewis also addresses the educators and innovators who seek to mold new values in the next generation. He warns that when people try to step outside the Tao to reshape human nature, they do not become creators, they become destroyers. They do not liberate, they manipulate. And once they abandon objective value, the only guide left is power. In this context, he introduces the idea of conditioners, future technocrats, educators, and elites who, having rejected the Tao, will attempt to shape humanity by their own will, but without any grounding in right and wrong. These conditioners have no reason to prefer kindness over cruelty, freedom over control. They will act not out of conscience, but out of preference or convenience. This is the grim paradox at the heart of Lewis's warning. Those who deny objective values in the name of freedom will ultimately use their freedom to destroy the very conditions that make it possible. They will become tyrants, not liberators. And the tragedy is that this tyranny won't always look like oppression. It might come dressed as compassion, education, or efficiency. It might speak in the language of psychology or progress. But beneath the surface, it will be the triumph of power over principle, of manipulation over meaning. Lewis's emphasis on the Tao also has a deeply practical dimension. He's not merely defending a theory, he's defending the conditions necessary for human flourishing. Without shared moral standards, society loses its cohesion. Laws become tools of control rather than expressions of justice. Education devolves into either indoctrination or nihilism, and public discourse becomes a shouting match between competing preferences. With no higher standard to appeal to, he draws attention to how this breakdown affects everyday life. In families, parents may feel uncertain about what values to pass on to their children, fearing they may impose outdated views. In schools, teachers become hesitant to discuss character or virtue, unsure whether any moral language is still legitimate. In politics, leaders appeal to feelings and factions instead of principles. And in culture, entertainment celebrates transgression more than aspiration. Lewis also anticipates the psychological consequences. A person raised without reference to the Tao may feel liberated at first, but over time they become anxious, fragmented, and disoriented. When every choice is a matter of preference, and no desire is better than another, individuals are left without a compass. They float in a sea of options with no sense of direction. This moral vertigo, Lewis warns, can be mistaken for freedom. But in truth, it is a kind of paralysis. He is not suggesting that returning to the Tao means blind obedience to past norms. Rather, he's urging discernment, recognizing that real moral insight builds on tradition, not against it. Just as scientific discoveries refine but do not discard the laws of nature, moral insight deepens when it honors the enduring truths at its core. Another powerful aspect of the way is Lewis's appeal to natural emotions and shared human experience. He reminds us that when we admire bravery, mourn betrayal, or recoil at cruelty, we are participating in something bigger than ourselves. These are not merely personal feelings, they are echoes of a moral reality that transcends culture and time. The Tao is not just a theory, it is something we already live by, often unconsciously. Lewis points to ancient texts and religious traditions, not to argue for one faith over another, but to demonstrate how widespread the Tao really is. Whether it's Confucius in China, the Stoics in Rome, or the prophets of Israel, humanity has always recognized a moral order. And whenever societies have tried to cast it off, whether in revolutionary France, totalitarian Russia, or in modern nihilism, the result has not been enlightenment, but chaos. This, Lewis warns, is the future of a world that abandons the way. We will not become gods. As the innovators dream, we will become slaves to power, appetite, or manipulation. And tragically, we may not even realize it. We will still speak the language of morality, but it will be hollow. We will say justice, but mean power. We will say love, but mean preference. We will still demand rights, but forget the responsibilities that gave them meaning. Ultimately, Lewis's plea is not just to preserve civilization, to preserve the soul. The way is not a cage, it is a path. And if we lose it, we don't merely lose our past, we lose our future. And in the end, the choice is ours. Either we walk within the way and remain truly human, or we step outside of it and become something less, something hollow, something no longer fully alive. This is Lewis's urgent appeal. In the final chapter of The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis delivers his boldest warning yet. The rejection of objective values doesn't merely change human behavior, it threatens to unmake humanity itself. This chapter, titled The Abolition of Man, is the culmination of all his prior arguments. If society continues down the path of discarding the Tao, the result will not be liberation or progress, will be the destruction of what makes us human. Lewis begins by returning to the concept of the Tao, which he now calls the doctrine of objective value. It is the foundational moral order that all meaningful ethics must rest upon. Without it, there is no rational basis for preferring one action to another, except for subjective feeling or the use of force. And yet, Lewis observes that many intellectuals and scientists of his time were advocating precisely for this kind of value-free worldview. He turns his focus to the consequences of rejecting the Tao at the level of human control. Once values are dismissed as subjective, then there is no reason to resist manipulating people for their own good. He envisions a future where human nature itself becomes the subject of experimentation, not to heal or help, but to control. In this world, a class of elites whom Lewis calls the conditioners will use technology, psychology, and propaganda to engineer the next generation. At first, this might sound like utopia. What could be better than raising people with carefully selected traits and attitudes? But Lewis digs deeper. He argues that without the Tao, the conditioners have no moral ground to prefer one trait over another. Why prefer courage to cowardice, truth to deception, or liberty to obedience? The only criteria left are power and preference. This leads to a terrifying conclusion. The conditioners are not guided by conscience, but by will. They are not forming people, they are manufacturing them. And since their values are arbitrary, the humans they shape are not truly free, moral beings. They are product creatures of another's design, molded not by reason but by impulse. Lewis insists that this transformation will be the end of man, not in the biological sense, but in the moral and spiritual sense. True humanity involves making choices within the boundaries of objective value. It means recognizing right and wrong, striving toward virtue, and submitting our desires to moral truth. But in the world of the conditioners, those boundaries disappear. Human nature becomes clay, and the soul is lost in the process. The most chilling part of Lewis's argument is that this dehumanization won't come with violence or cruelty. It might come with kindness, sophistication, and good intentions. The conditioners may think they are helping humanity, protecting it from suffering. guiding it toward peace. But in doing so, they strip away the very dignity they claim to protect. Lewis highlights that throughout history, humans have always shaped one another through culture, tradition, and moral education. But this shaping was done within the Tao. It was an attempt to pass down wisdom, not impose will. The difference is crucial. Under the Tao, the educator submits to the same moral law as the student. Under the conditioners, the student is molded according to the educator's preferences, with no higher standard to appeal to. He explores the idea that the power of man over nature, often celebrated as progress, is, in reality, the power of some men over others. Every scientific breakthrough, every new method of control, simply enhances the ability of the few to direct the lives of the many. This isn't inherently evil until it is detached from any moral compass. Consider genetic engineering, behavioral conditioning, or mass surveillance. These are powerful tools. In the hands of people guided by the Tao, they might be used to heal or protect. But without the Tao, they become tools of dominance. The future Lewis imagines is not one of shared freedom, but of engineered conformity. Lewis calls this the final stage of man's conquest of nature, when man's own nature is the target. And in achieving this conquest, we abolish the very thing we sought to perfect. We no longer have humans shaped by truth, but creatures shaped by manipulation. We do not raise moral beings, we program preferences, and in this, humanity is abolished. He emphasizes that this isn't a distant possibility, it's already underway. The seeds are in our textbooks, our laboratories, our policies. The idea that we can shape human nature without reference to any moral truth is already accepted by many as enlightened thinking. But Lewis sees it as the first step toward moral extinction. The irony, Lewis notes, is that in rejecting objective value to gain power over ourselves, we lose what makes that power meaningful. A man who conquers his instincts in obedience to moral truth is noble. But a man who suppresses his instincts through manipulation loses his freedom. He becomes a puppet, not a person. He does not transcend nature. He falls beneath it. Lewis concludes with a passionate appeal. If humanity is to survive not just physically, but morally and spiritually, we must return to the Tao. We must recognize that values are not social constructs or evolutionary leftovers. They are the framework of human dignity. They are what distinguish us from animals and machines. Without them, we are nothing to resist the abolition of man. We must uphold the moral law not as a burden, but as a lifeline. We must teach our children not only to reason, but to feel rightly. We must pass down the wisdom of generations, not because it is old, but because it is true. And we must use our power not to reshape humanity in our image, but to live in harmony with the truth that transcends us. For Lewis, this is not a conservative plea to turn back time. It is a radical call to preserve what is essential. Progress is not the enemy, but progress without principle is. The future belongs not to those who conquer human nature, but to those who honor it. The abolition of man is not inevitable, but it is possible, and the choice is ours. Lewis also explores how this new power over human nature changes the very definition of ethics. In a world ruled by the conditioners, ethics no longer appeals to a transcendent good. It becomes a matter of policy, preference, or utility. Concepts like right and wrong are reduced to what works or what feels beneficial to those in control. And since there is no shared standard by which to judge these decisions, ethical reasoning becomes a facade. What is presented as good may be nothing more than ... This shift has deep implications for freedom. When humans are no longer taught to respond rightly to moral truths, but are instead conditioned to respond automatically to stimuli, the result is not freedom, but programming. Lewis warns that in the name of rationality and progress, we may create a world where people act not out of conviction, but out of behavioral design. In such a world, dissent isn't debated, it's corrected. Resistance isn't respected, it is reprogrammed. Lewis's vision is prophetic. Long before the rise of algorithmic personalization, targeted advertising, or AI-driven behavior modification, he foresaw a future in which human thought itself could be shaped by external systems. What alarms him is not just the loss of privacy or autonomy, but the deeper loss of the human soul, its ability to choose, to discern, and to seek truth. When we hand over the shaping of minds to impersonal systems, we risk becoming what he feared most, creatures of system. No. The chapter also contains an implicit critique of scientism, the belief that science alone can answer all of life's questions. Lewis is careful to distinguish science as a method from scientism as a worldview. He honors the achievements of science, but he cautions against using scientific authority to make moral judgments. Science can tell us how something works, but it cannot tell us whether it should be done. That domain belongs to ethics, philosophy, and religion, all of which rests upon the Tao. When the Tao is discarded, science becomes dangerous, not because it is false, but because it is powerful. In the hands of people unmoored from morality, technology becomes a tool for domination. It allows the conditioners to bypass persuasion and appeal directly to instinct or biology. This is not education, it is engineering. And while it may produce order or efficiency, it will not produce goodness, justice, or love. Lewis is not against innovation, nor is he a pessimist by nature, but he believes that the unchecked pursuit of control over nature, over others, and ultimately over ourselves, leads to a hollow world. In seeking to master everything, we may master nothing of real value. We may become gods in capacity, but devils in character. The final victory over nature may, ironically, destroy the nature that made the victory possible. He closes the chapter with a haunting reflection. The abolition of man is not just a future danger, it is already underway. The signs are in how we educate our children, how we define success, how we use technology, and how we speak about right and wrong. If we do not act now to reaffirm objective value, we may soon find ourselves living in a world where meaning itself has been engineered out of existence. Lewis's final warning is both simple and profound. The crisis he describes is not merely intellectual, it is existential. It concerns what kind of beings we will become, and whether we will continue to be truly human. The power to reshape human nature is real, and it is growing. But the question is not whether we can, it is whether we should. If we abandon the Tao, we abandon our compass. If we silence the voice of conscience, we amplify the voice of power. And if we trade virtue for control, we may find that we have gained the world and lost our souls. And yet, Lewis offers hope. The very fact that we can recognize this danger means we have not yet succumbed to it. The Tao still speaks in our longing for justice, in our admiration for courage, in our love for truth. We must listen. We must teach our children to listen, and we must be brave enough to affirm that some things are truly good, and some things truly evil. To preserve our humanity, we must reject the illusion that all values are subjective. We must reclaim the truth that our emotions, when rightly ordered, are not irrational. They are the response of the heart to reality. This is what Lewis meant by education, not just the shaping of minds, but the training of souls. The abolition of man is not inevitable. But if we do nothing, if we mock virtue, deny truth, and surrender our conscience to convenience, we will wake one day to find that humanity, as we once knew it, has disappeared. And we will have no one to blame but ourselves. C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man is not just a philosophical essay, it's a moral emergency broadcast. Through the progression of his argument, from the critique of moral relativism in education to the prophetic vision of a world without the Tao, Lewis gives us a sobering reflection on what's at stake when we reject objective value. And as we reach the conclusion, his message is clear. We are standing on a threshold. The decisions we make now, as individuals and as a civilization, will shape not onl ... What Lewis warns against is subtle and seductive. The drive for autonomy, the allure of progress, the promise of control, they all seem noble on the surface. But beneath them lies a dangerous presumption that we can replace timeless wisdom with contemporary whim, that human nature is malleable clay we can reform, without consequence. Yet, as Lewis shows, when we sever morality from its roots, we do not grow, we wither. Throughout this audiobook, we've encountered his powerful metaphors: men without chests, educators as conditioners, reason without the Tao, and man's conquest of nature becoming nature's conquest of man. These are not just literary devices, they are Lewis's attempt to shake us awake. He wants us to see that the battle for values is not abstract. It is intensely personal. It plays out in every classroom, policy, parenting choice, and cultural norm. It is a battle for the soul. The remedy, Lewis argues, is not to abandon modernity, but to anchor it. Science is not the enemy. Technology is not the villain. The true danger lies in using these tools without virtue, in applying power without wisdom. The Tao is not a nostalgic return to the past, toward true human flourishing, grounded in what has always been true. Lewis's closing vision is both sobering and inspiring. On the one hand, he offers no illusions. The abolition of man is not a sci-fi fantasy, is a trajectory we are already on. But on the other hand, he believes in the power of education rightly ordered. He believes that by restoring objective value to its proper place, not as dogma, but as a lived moral reality, we can recover what has been lost. What would this recovery look like? It would begin with a renewal of education, not just as information transfer, but as character formation. Schools would not be afraid to speak of virtue. Literature classes would not only analyze form, but celebrate courage, loyalty, and honor. History would not just recount conflicts, but illuminate justice. Teachers would not only shape intellects, but nurture hearts. And students would not merely be trained for careers, they would be prepared for life. It would also require a cultural shift. We must learn to admire rightly. Popular culture would need heroes, again not just anti-heroes. Communities would once again uphold ideals of service, sacrifice, truthfulness, not because they are fashionable, but because they are good. Families would raise children not merely to succeed, but to become people of integrity. And finally, it would require moral courage. The courage to affirm that some values are not relative, that justice, mercy, love, and truth are not cultural constructs, they are reflections of a deeper reality. The courage to live by conscience, even when it's unpopular, to speak the truth, even when it costs us, and to teach the next generation not just how to think, but how to live well. Lewis ends The Abolition of Man not with despair, but with a call to action. He does not merely criticize modern trends. He calls for renewal. He calls for men and women of character who will resist the drift toward moral emptiness and stand firm in the truth. People who will raise their children not as blank slates or programmable beings, but as souls meant for greatness, responsibility, and freedom. This message is even more relevant today. In an age of rapid change, where digital tools reshape our minds and values are traded for convenience, Lewis's voice cuts through the noise like a bell. He reminds us that humanity is not a puzzle to be solved or a project to be engineered, is a mystery to be honored. And the Tao, the objective moral law, is not a limitation, it is a foundation. So let us take up this vision. Let us commit to being people with chests, with minds that think clearly, appetites rightly ordered, and hearts trained in virtue. Let us rebuild the moral architecture of our culture, one act of integrity at a time. Let us refuse the abolition of man, instead pursue the restoration of man. If you found this audiobook meaningful, share it with others who hunger for truth. Let Lewis's message be a spark in classrooms, homes, communities, and conversations. And if this vision stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Start living it, because the future of humanity depends not on more knowledge, but on more wisdom. And wisdom begins when we dare to say, there is truth, there is good, there is right, and we must live like it.